Welcome back to another episode of EDPS Talks, where together with our guests, we explore their unique perspective on data protection and privacy and how they shape their respective fields. Let me introduce our next speaker for today, Eliška Pírková. Eliška is a legal expert and digital right advocate known for her work in internet governance and online freedom of expression. She serves as a Senior Policy Analyst and a Global Freedom of Expression Lead at Access Now, a not-profit organization dedicated to defending digital rights worldwide. The focus is on issues like content moderation, platform accountability, and the protection of human rights in the digital field, advocating for transparent and user-centric internet policies. Her work aims to safeguard free speech while addressing the challenges posed by misinformation and harmful online content. Eliška will bring a wealth of knowledge and experience for today's discussion. We are thrilled to have you here with us. Thank you, Eliška, for joining us, and welcome to EDPS Talks.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Eliška, let's start with a question that we ask to all our guests. What does privacy mean to you, and how do you apply it in your everyday life?
Thank you very much. This is a great question indeed. I think that privacy is first and foremost fundamental rights that has to be protected and not unjustifiably restricted by state or private companies. Privacy is also, or the essence of the right to privacy, is sort of a precondition for a full enjoyment of other fundamental rights and freedoms that are laid down in the EU Charter and other international human rights treaties. Without adequate protection of the right to privacy, we can hardly speak about protected freedom of thought and opinion, which we could witness and experience on a number of abusive data practices, either in the context of elections or by a number of other occasions that are now well documented. And it's equally important for right to freedom of expression and opinion and adequate access to information. If we do not feel safe and secure in the online environment, meaning we cannot trust that our most personal information and data is being adequately protected and not abused, then we can hardly feel that we can freely express our views, opinions, and ultimately participate in public discourse and public life. So I try to keep that in mind every day when I use social media platforms, which I also have, and I try to practice these mindset of privacy protection in my everyday life, from thinking twice, what do I consent to, how do I consent, how those information are being communicated to me, how difficult or easy it is to access information, how my data is being processed, under what circumstances, and whether I as a user have any choice in how my information and data is processed by these companies that are nowadays enabling basic services that we use on an everyday basis.
Thank you so much. I have another question for you. Against the backdrop of the so-called super election year, where do you see the main challenges for freedom of expression and opinion? Many people, including big organizations like The Guardian, decided to leave Twitter. What's your thought about it?
Very big question indeed, and something we all keep thinking about. What it actually means that now we have a couple of tech moguls who own big social media platforms used by millions and millions of people around the world for accessing information, expressing their political views, running their political campaigns. And that, of course, brings many advantages, but especially huge disadvantages, given that these are one individuals who are private owners of public sphere. I would say that what we are facing right now, especially as a consequence of numerous elections around the world, where we see surge of right-wing political parties, democratic backsliding, which is also on the increase within the European Union as well. It's the instrumentalization of freedom of expression and opinion. We hear from these political leaders using the language of freedom of expression, but in reality defending very absolutistic and often non-democratic views that are definitely not in line with basic human rights safeguards and protections. We saw that also in the case of US elections and on a number of other occasions. Of course, freedom of expression also means protection against illegal forms of hate speech. It's a protection against incitement to violence that is often being directed against marginalized groups. And this in company with prevailing securitization mindset, when national security suddenly has to come first to an extent that might be disproportionate, especially when it comes to curtailing human rights and basic freedoms. This can be a combination that will deliver a perfect storm, and the democracies will be ultimately on the receiving end of these negative outcomes that these policy, legislative, and political developments probably will have. We also see that on the civic space and the environment in which civil society organizations like Access Now and a number of others have to operate nowadays. It's a more and more or gradually more hostile environment where even though our number one mission is to protect and uphold basic values that the European Union stands on, we often encounter unjustified resistance from state and other actors in doing our everyday mission, and that's protecting human rights over profit.
Thank you. And what do you think about these big actors, these big tech giants? Do you think that the EU is equipped to control their actions?
So the European Union is trying its utmost best to be ready and to finally establish legally binding obligations laid down in newly created regulations that are specifically targeting big players. Of course, the Digital Services Act does that from the perspective of platform accountability and content governance, where these particular regulations singles out large platforms and search engines and assign to them specific set of most advanced obligations in the law. And then its sister regulation, Digital Market Act, tackles gatekeepers, so those who have a very dominant economic and competition power in the market. These are early days to see how successful EU will be in taming big tech. The first enforcement action is taking place as we speak, and we need to see whether the European Union is truly well equipped to put its foot down and make sure that these newly developed obligations will be adequately enforced and whether they will deliver to its mark. But I would say that I still remain cautiously optimistic, which is not to say that I'm also overly optimistic, of course.
Interesting, thank you. You mentioned all this new legislation adopted during the former mandate. And how do you see freedom of expression and data protection coexisting with this new landscape, regulatory landscape of new policies adopted during the last mandate?
I am very happy to finally see a proper shift in thinking about freedom of expression and data protection. Back in days, these two used to be kept in silos, often even posed against each other, either indirectly, perhaps even through the jurisprudence of the court, or somehow as competing rights. Nowadays, we fully realize that there cannot be a successful case of content moderation or establishing human rights compliant regime for user-generated content without protecting users or people's data. For instance, this is a very good example, content recommender systems that are being optimized on our online behaviors, our preferences, what we like, what we dislike, and all of that are often extremely sensitive data about us, from our political views to our sexual orientation, our religious affiliations, and all of that is being fed into these systems that then determine what will show up on the top of our news feeds. And in one way or another, and we are still trying to get more and more data to properly understand how these algorithms operating in the background shape our worldviews, our political opinions, and the way how we actually form an opinion. So in my view, and this is also partially reflected in those newly adopted regulations, we finally see that freedom of expression desperately needs adequate data protection standards and principles, and vice versa. One cannot be safeguarded without another. These are not competing rights. They are equally important and they are mutually reinforcing.
Thank you. You mentioned enforcement. It was quite early to assess whether enforcement was working, but could you already say today what would be the basic elements to improve enforcement?
I think these are still early days. For instance, in case of Digital Services Act, it's a still very young regulation, and we have to see how all those formal proceedings will develop. We already have a preliminary outcome of investigation against X, where the Commission did find a violation of the Digital Services Act. But of course, more needs to happen. And we also have to ensure that the consequences for systemic non-compliance with the existing EU regulation, whether it's the DSA or any other regulation from these arsenal against big tech that the European Union developed, that these consequences are real for platforms, that they do understand that non-compliance with their newly established obligation and fundamental rights protection has a real consequences.
Eliška, we are at the beginning of a new mandate for the EU, and the hearings of the commissioners designate are still running. What would you expect from the agenda on digital rights?
I must admit, when I follow the hearings of commissioner designates, and more specifically, the hearing of commissioner designate Virkkunen, I would expect more fundamental rights language and the emphasis on the importance of fundamental rights. I fully agree with the objectives of the commissioners that we definitely need to strengthen protection of minors in online ecosystem. But I was a bit uneasy about how much emphasis was placed on competition and ability to compete, innovation, and a number of other aspects over protection of people and their rights. It is a bit disappointing given that, for instance, and I go again to what I know the best, the Digital Services Act, one of its strengths is that it places protection of people in the core of the regulation. So this will be definitely something we will closely follow in the case of new mandate and potential new legislation that will be coming from the European Commission, that the message of fundamental rights protection and equality for all won't get lost or deprioritize over issues such as national security. And I think in terms of what we would expect from the European Commission, the number one thing is to, of course, protect fundamental rights, equality, and justice for all. So we don't see too much emphasis on criminalization and disproportionate criminalizing of, for instance, solidarity movements, but also disproportionate criminalization in the era of migration, where we expect that a lots of security mindset will be translated into concrete action of the European Union and its member states. And this usually leads to serious fundamental rights abuse. We also want to see that the European Union will continue fostering transparent governance and effective enforcement so that the good that was achieved during the previous mandate would be adequately enforced. And at the same time, shortcomings in existing regulations, such as, for instance, Migration Pact, will be mitigated and prevented from causing more harm. And that will be definitely the mission of civil rights organizations such as Access Now, EDRI, and a number of other important players. We also want to continue see and support sustainable European Union, a European Union that takes environment and the consequences of big tech for environment seriously and comes up with responses that can tackle these serious challenges, at least to a large extent. And finally, European Union has important geopolitical role. It has a significant influence over many other jurisdictions in the global majority, and not always for better. And it's important that the European Union takes its role as a defender of the rule of law, democracy, and human rights seriously, and keep that as a number one priority in its international geopolitical and foreign diplomacy.
What is, in your view, the most significant digital battles that we will see in the next 5 years?
Because of this strong emphasis on national security within the European Union and also by member states, the biggest battle will be exactly there to strike the right balance between fundamental rights protection and national security exemptions, and also making sure that people's safety will be prioritized even over national security and not the other way around. And this is, for instance, reflected also in the use of technology from artificial intelligence, including technology that is currently being developed and used on European Union borders. And we, of course, know and pointed out to on many occasions, together with partner organizations, that some of these technologies are so inherently harmful and cause so much human rights abuse that cannot be prevented or mitigated, that they simply should not be used at all. And similarly to that, what is increasingly more and more worrisome, we see a lot of member states, or a lot, let's say more and more member states relying on technologies such as deployment of spyware. We see the use of spyware often being deployed against journalists, human rights defenders, or political opposition. In these cases, we would like to finally see a strong standard coming from European Union that will pose a ban on the use of commercial spyware, especially when it's being used against these protected categories such as journalists, and it will have only detrimental impact on the rule of law, democracy, and fundamental rights protection. So precisely the securitization mindset that will be directly posed against human rights protection, that's where we see the biggest battle that we will need to take. And in the terms of freedom of expression, again, instrumentalization of this fundamental freedom and abuse of the essence of freedom of expression by those who don't necessarily want to strengthen protection of these fundamental rights, but rather benefit and abuse its protective scope.
Looking a bit in the future, privacy and human rights go hand in hand by being positive but also skeptical. How do you envisage our society and our democracies in 20 years?
Wow, 20 years is a long time. And of course, I don't have a crystal ball and I'm not a great fortune teller. But I can maybe think of what needs to be done now. So that future in 20 years is something where we as a society that believes in those core values that European Union stands on are happy to live in, the environment that actually serves to people and not to those very few fortunate in power. And that, again, it's not the profit of those very few privileged that is driving the agenda either in the European Union and in the world. So to me, I see the way that we are now standing on the crossroad. Some even call it the change of the world order, where our positions, values, and principles that we so passionately defend are being seriously questioned, abused, and challenged. And it's also the time when we have to rethink some of our own positions on a number of pending issues around the digital rights, whether they can still withstand the test of time and what we are currently going through. Those more skeptical could even call it a crisis for freedom of expression, crisis for data protection, or crisis for fundamental rights. But I still believe that something positive can come out of these crises if we remain strong, if the legislators continue to listen to external expertise and stakeholders who are watchdogs of democracies and basic values, such as human rights and a number of other important constitutional principles. So ideally, in 20 years from now, I would like to look back, God knows where I will be at that time, and think, well, we didn't maybe manage to fulfill every single part of our mission, but we did well. And we somehow contributed, hopefully, to the brighter future that I still believe lies somewhere there ahead of us.
Thank you, Eliška. That brings us to the end of today's discussion. We have discussed various perspectives on data protection and privacy, and you shed the light on so many things. Let me just remind some elements that I think were important. The first thing is that you confirmed that the data protection was really a fundamental right, which was there to support other fundamental rights as well, that it was really important to understand. I think also you explain how the new instruments like the DSA and the DMA will help to shape a better digital future in the EU. Also, how in the new agenda of the legislator, there should be a focus on the digital right of people, but also that the Commission should also make sure that safety of people, but also equality of people should come over national security. And I think we all understood how important was the work of civil society like Access Now, for example. It was really a pleasure to have you here, and I hope to see you soon around.
Thank you so much. It was a great pleasure to be here as well, and honor, and hopefully see you out there.
We hope these insights give you a fresh perspective on privacy and data protection. If you enjoy the episodes, don't forget to catch up on previous interviews and follow the EDPS channel to discover more about our project, making the 20th anniversary of the European Data Protection Supervisor. I'm Romain Robert, and it was the EDPS talk with Eliška Pírková, Senior Policy Analyst and Global Lead for Freedom of Expression at Access Now. See you in the next talk.